How much tax are Singaporeans really paying? Now, Singaporeans have been told that we pay one of the lowest taxes, but is this true? Let's take a look. We compare Singapore with the Nordic countries, Finland and Sweden. The Nordic countries have been known to pay one of the highest taxes in the world. So how does Singapore compare? Indeed, when you look at personal income tax, Singaporeans do pay low personal income tax. We contribute 10% into total government revenue. In Finland and Sweden, it is 35% and 40% respectively. So when you look at it, Singaporeans do look like we pay low taxes. But do you know that Singaporeans pay 3 times more into CPF as compared to personal income tax, whereas in Finland and Sweden, they pay only 1 time and 0.5 times more into Social Security. So when you look at how much Singaporeans pay into personal income tax and CPF, we pay 40% out of total government revenue, whereas in Finland and Sweden, this is 60% and 55%. Now when you look at it, what Singaporeans pay isn't exactly too far off from what the people in Finland and Sweden pay. But that's not all. When you add indirect tax, Singaporeans pay 3.5 times more into indirect tax as compared to personal income tax, whereas in Finland and Sweden, they pay only 1 time more. So when you add it all up, what Singaporeans pay into personal income tax, CPF and indirect tax is 85% of total government revenue. And in Finland and Sweden, this is 95%. Now when you add it all up, what Singaporeans pay is actually not too far off from what the people in Finland and Sweden pay. Now let's take a look at it from a per capita perspective. Singaporeans pay 2,000 per capita into personal income tax, whereas in Finland and Sweden, they pay 10,000 and 15,000 per capita respectively. And again, Singaporeans pay 3 times more into CPF, and in Finland and Sweden, they pay 1 time and 0.5 times more. So Singaporeans contribute 6,000 into CPF, whereas in Finland and Sweden, they contribute 7,000 and 6,000 into Social Security. And when you look at it, what Singaporeans pay into CPF is actually the same as what the people in Finland and Sweden pay into Social Security. So in total, what Singaporeans pay into personal income tax and CPF is 8,000 as compared to what the people in Finland and Sweden pay, $17,000 and $21,000 respectively. Again, Singaporeans do look like we pay low income taxes and CPF. But do you know that on top of what we pay into personal income tax and CPF, Singaporeans have to pay another 8,000 out of pocket for healthcare, education and retirement. But in Finland and Sweden, the citizens are able to obtain these basic necessities for free. What this means is that on top of personal income tax and CPF, Singaporeans have to pay another 8,000 into out-of-pocket expenditure, which means that we spend a total of 16,000. This is compared to what the people in Finland and Sweden pay of 17,000 and 21,000 respectively. Again, when you look at it, Singaporeans actually pay almost the same amount as what the people in Finland and Sweden do. We are not exactly paying low taxes. Now, if you look at how much Singaporeans pay in personal income tax, CPF and indirect tax, we pay 16,000 as compared to what the people in Finland and Sweden pay of $26,000 and $35,000 respectively. But how much does the Singapore government give back in social protection? The Singapore government gives back 58% in social protection, or $9,000 per capita. But in Finland and Sweden, the government gives a much higher proportion back to the citizens in terms of social protection. In Finland, this is 91%, and in Sweden, this is 79%. So what the governments contribute back to the people in Finland and Sweden is $24,000 and $28,000 per capita respectively. Now, if the Singapore government has given back into social protection at the same rate as what the Finnish government and the Swedish government has done, Singaporeans should be getting 90% back, which means that Singaporeans should be getting 14,000 back. That means that there is an expenditure of 5,000 which is lost, which is not given back to Singaporeans in social protection. Now, if we look at how much Singaporeans pay into direct and indirect tax, CPF, and out-of-pocket expenditure, Singaporeans actually spend $23,000 per capita. Now, this includes what Singaporeans spend out of pocket for healthcare, education, and retirement. In Finland, their citizens only need to pay into tax and social security and get healthcare, education, and retirement for free. In total, they pay $27,000 and $36,000 per capita, respectively. Now again, you can see that what Singaporeans pay isn't exactly too far off from what the Finnish and Swedes pay. But more importantly, how much median wages do Singaporeans have? Singaporeans only earn $36,000 every year. In comparison, in Finland, they earn 156% more than Singaporeans do. The Finnish earn $56,000 every year. And in Sweden, they earn 167% more than the Singaporeans do. The Swedes earn $60,000 every year. So if Singaporeans earn such low median wages, but we pay almost the same amounts as the people in the Nordic countries do, how much of our median wages do we actually have to pay into tax, CPF, and out-of-pocket expenditure? Singaporeans actually pay 65% of our wages into tax, CPF, and out-of-pocket expenditure. Whereas if you look at how much the people in Finland and Sweden pay, they only pay 47% and 59% respectively. So because Singaporeans earn such low wages, we have to pay a larger proportion of our wages into basic necessities. Now what is worse is if you look at the income distribution in Singapore. For the poorest 20% in Singapore, they only have a share of 5% of the income in Singapore, whereas in Finland and Sweden, they have 10% and 9% respectively. And how about for the poorest 80% in Singapore? We only have 51% of the share of income in Singapore, whereas in Finland and Sweden, they have 63% of the share of income. So what this means is that the poorest 20% in Singapore is actually the poorest 20% as compared to all the high-income countries. And for the poorest 80% in Singapore, we are also the poorest compared to the poorest 80% in all the other high-income countries. So what does this mean for the richest 20% in Singapore? They have 49% of the share of income in Singapore as compared to only 37% in Finland and Sweden. This also means that the richest 20% in Singapore are the richest as compared to the richest 20% in the other high-income countries. And if you look at someone who earns $800 in Singapore, a person who earns $800 in Singapore, say a cleaner, earns $10,000 every year. Now in comparison to his or her counterparts in Finland, a cleaner earns 260% more in wages, or $25,000 every year. And in Sweden, this is 460% more, or $44,000 every year. And if you look at how much the Singaporean has left after deducting for income tax, CPF, basic expenditure, housing, transport, food, education, and healthcare, the Singaporean would go into a debt of more than $1,000. However, in Finland and Sweden, they would still be able to save $8,000 and $15,000 respectively for the year. Now how about someone who earns $1,800 in Singapore, say for example a bus driver? And there are about 35% of Singaporeans who earn $1,800 or less in Singapore. So for a person who earns $1,800, he would earn $22,000 in a year. In comparison, for his or her counterpart, they would earn 220% more in Finland, or $47,000 a year, or 250% more in Sweden, or $54,000 a year. And again, after deducting for all expenditure for basic necessities, tax, and CPF, a Singaporean would go into a deficit of more than $200. Whereas once again in Finland and Sweden, they would be able to save $18,000 every year. So you can see, because the income inequality is so wide, where the poorest 5% is the poorest in Singapore as compared to all the high-income countries, and where the richest 20% is also the richest as compared to all the high-income countries, Singaporeans have the highest income inequality as compared to all the other high-income countries. In comparison, Finland and Sweden have one of the lowest income inequality as compared to all the other high-income countries. And if you look at the poverty rate in Singapore, it is estimated that there is a 26% poverty rate in Singapore, or more than 26% of Singaporeans are living in poverty. Whereas in Finland and Sweden, it is only 5.5% and 7% respectively. So let's sum it all up. How much Singaporeans pay into personal income tax, CPF and out-of-pocket expenditure? At 16,000, it's actually not too far off from what the people in Finland and Sweden pay. We are actually paying almost the same amounts. And when you look at how much the government gives back, the government in Singapore gives back a significantly lower amount than what the governments in Finland and Sweden gives back. And so how much do Singaporeans have to pay from our wages? Because we have such low wages, and yet we still pay the same amounts as what the people in Finland and Sweden do. Singaporeans contribute a much larger chunk of our wages into tax, CPF and out-of-pocket expenditure, whereas in Finland and Sweden they pay a lower proportion of their wages. And the rich in Singapore, the richest 20% have 49% of the share of income, whereas in Finland and Sweden it's only 37%. And for the poor, because the poorest 20% have the lowest share of income in Singapore as compared to all the other high-income countries, this means that they are not able to save, but in fact would go into deficit. And what this means is that they would have to forgo some form of expenditure. But in Finland and Sweden, they would still be able to save a significant amount of money every year. And this is why when you look at how many Singaporeans are still living in poverty, you will see that there is at least a quarter of Singaporeans who are living in poverty, whereas this is less than 10% in Finland and Sweden. So Singaporeans have been told that we pay the lowest taxes. But this is true. We have shown you that when you look at how much Singaporeans pay into personal income tax, CPF and out-of-pocket expenditure, when you add this all up, what Singaporeans pay for what we need to spend into basic necessities is actually almost the same as what the people in the Nordic countries do. So if you really look at it, what Singaporeans pay is actually one of the highest in the world. But we actually get back the lowest benefits among the high-income countries. The Singapore government actually spends the lowest in social protection and the lowest proportion of GDP into public expenditure. Now indeed, this is quite worrying. Singaporeans have been told that we pay low taxes and thus we are not able to receive social protection for free. But if we are indeed paying the same amount as what the Nordic countries are paying, then should we not be receiving social protection for free as well? In fact, from what we have seen, because the government spends such a low amount on social protection, the poor are not able to receive healthcare and education and retirement benefits. They are left out in the cold. So the question we have to ask ourselves is this: if indeed Singaporeans are already paying almost the same amount as what the people in the Nordic countries are spending, would it be better if we continue the model that we are already adopting now, or is it better if we pay whatever we are already paying into personal income tax, CPF and indirect tax, and have it be redistributed back to Singaporeans for free healthcare, free education, and retirement benefits that are a lot higher than what we are receiving now? So this is something that we have to think about. If you would like to find out more about the tax system in Singapore in comparison with the other countries, do come down to the Pre-Budget 2014 Forum. It will be held on 15 February, Saturday, 2 to 5 p.m. at the TKP Conference Centre, Raffles Place, Hall 1. This forum is organized by Empowering Singaporeans and supported by Marua, Function 8, and Workfare Singapore. Mr. Tang King Lian and Ms. Vivian Wee from Aware will also be speaking at the forum. We look forward to seeing you there.